Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Carne Ross. Carne served as a member of Her Majesty's diplomatic service in the United Kingdom for 15 years, from 1989 until 2004, where his roles included being the UK's representative to the United Nations during the Iraq War. Upon his resignation, he gave testimony to the UK Parliament about the UK government's lies to the public during the Iraq War, and underwent a personal transformation towards anarchist politics, which is portrayed in the autobiographical documentary Carne made entitled Accidental Anarchist. He is the founder and former executive director of Independent Diplomat, an advisory group for opposition governments and democratic movements on diplomatic strategy. He's also the associate director for Geopolitics, Diplomacy and Security at E3G, a climate change think tank, and a member of the International Advisory Council of the Institute for Integrated Transitions, as well as the author of the books Independent Diplomat, Dispatches from an Unaccountable Elite, and Leaderless Revolution. Thank you very much for speaking with us today, Carne.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure, really. So I wanted to begin by asking you about your personal history. If you could talk a bit about your upbringing and the conditions of the time when you were growing up. And you've mentioned elsewhere in the film that I mentioned, The Accidental Anarchist, that your grandfather had worked as a code breaker in Bletchley Park during the Second World War, and that as a child you had dreamed of being a fighter pilot, but that you failed the entrance admissions for the RAF due to your colorblindness, the eye test issue. And from there you decided to be a diplomat. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more as a child, your aspirations and imaginations around this, and more particularly, what inspired you to want to be a diplomat, and how are you envisioning that to be?
Sure. Well, I was always very political as a child. I don't really quite know why. I think it was out of boredom, a bourgeois suburban existence, that politics and international relations was the kind of way out from that very claustrophobic environment that I was brought up in. I was very much fascinated by international relations. I was brought up a child of Thatcher, but also a child of the Cold War, where the threat of nuclear war was always present, and logic such as mutually assured destruction, détente, governed our international world. I also lived through the Falklands War, of course, which was very exciting for a teenage boy, as I was at the time. And I think that all fed my ambition to be a diplomat, that I wanted to understand the order of the world, how things fitted together, in a sense, how the chessboard of international relations worked. And today I completely reject the metaphor of the chessboard, but at that time I would have accepted it. And I wanted to know how the pieces fitted together and how you played the game. And above all, I wanted to be a player of the game. And the Foreign Office was very much idolized in my family. Both my parents and my sister had applied to join and all failed. And as the stupidest one of the family, anointed when my twin brother was put in the year ahead of me, I felt this was a worthy ambition to prove that I wasn't quite so dumb. And I held on to this ambition. And it was one of the things about it is the Foreign Office is a very established route for people of a certain class in Britain. There are people of other classes who would never imagine it as a possible career. And in my day and in my class, sort of upper middle class, well-educated, private education, the Foreign Office was a plausible career. And so I chose it, and eventually managed to fulfill that ambition when I joined in 1989.
So thank you for that. And so as you said, you joined in 1989, and at this time, this is the time of really the Cold War coming to an end now, and you have the Berlin Wall coming down and the Soviet Union collapsing a couple years later. Can you tell us what it was like at this time to, as you mentioned already, growing up during the environment of the Cold War had shaped you immensely as it did, the whole world. What was the atmosphere in the Foreign Service like at that time? And can you tell us what your experiences were during that time, and give us a bit of an overview of your career as a diplomat from that point on, including how you came to specialize in the Middle East and your the role that you played during, as I mentioned before, the representative to the United Nations during the Iraq War for the UK, a bit of your experiences during this time as well.
Sure. Well, in 1989, I think it would be overstating it to say the mood was one of triumphalism, but definitely the great ideological battle that had shaped the post-war world had been won, and won in our favor. That representative democracy, market economics, whatever neoliberalism, as we would not have called it in those days, had been triumphant over communism. And I don't think there was a kind of rub your nose in it triumphalism about it, but there was certainly a sense that our model had won through, and that the main task now was to transport that model to the former states of the Soviet Empire, of the Warsaw Pact, places like the Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, etc. And amongst the most coveted postings were postings to those diplomatic postings to those countries, to help them understand representative democracy and market economics, which in a way was a slightly condescending way of looking at it. But I think it illustrates the way that the British government, the elites, thought about it at the time, that others need to be inculcated into our way of doing things, that it was, in a sense, for Francis Fukuyama's end of history, that we'd reached the telos of history, after which there would be nothing else dramatic, because the ultimate optimal organizational state of humanity had been achieved. Of course, that didn't turn out quite that way, but anyway, that's another story. As for me, I was posted to Germany, which was a very interesting posting, because Germany had just reunited with the East in the 4+2 process, and was coming to terms with itself as a united country, was exploring a new politics, quite a nationalistic politics in a way, what they call Schwächer Nationalismus, weak nationalism, of a Germany that was very much dominant in the European Union, and a major foreign policy player. And my job was to follow it and report on it, which was fascinating. The reason I got involved in the Middle East was, after my posting in Germany, I was appointed as head of the grandly named Arab Israel section of the Near East North Africa department in the Foreign Office, which was essentially the desk, the section of the Foreign Office dealing with Palestine. And that was just kind of chance. That job came up when I was going back to London. I'm not a Middle East expert. I don't speak Arabic or Hebrew for that matter. And I haven't lived in any of those countries of the Middle East, so I don't regard myself as an expert. But nevertheless, it was felt in the sort of classical view of the Foreign Office, the talented amateur, that people like me could do jobs like that. As a result of a speech I wrote on the Palestine issue for the then Foreign Secretary, I was made the Foreign Secretary's speechwriter. And this was, in those days, a Tory, Malcolm Rifkind, which was ironic because even then my politics were pretty left. But in those days, career civil servants were expected to serve whichever foreign secretary, whichever party they came from, even if you were in as political a role as a speechwriter. And so I served as his speechwriter for a bit, and then briefly when New Labour was elected in '97 for his successor, Robin Cook, of course, of the Labour Party, but he didn't like my speeches or didn't like my style, and he fired me, which is a very unusual thing to happen in the Foreign Office. And everybody was very gleeful at this rare occurrence of somebody actually being sacked. But of course, that doesn't actually mean you lose your job. You're just transferred to another job. And because of my quote unquote Middle East background, I was appointed to the Middle East job at the UK representation to the United Nations in New York, where I covered all the Middle East, including Palestine, the Lockerbie case, Western Sahara, and above all Iraq, where I covered the efforts to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction, pressurizing the country through the use of economic sanctions, which we can perhaps come on to.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as you just alluded to now, the issue of WMDs in Iraq, the after your resignation from the Foreign Service, you gave testimony to the UK Parliament that you, providing evidence that the UK government knew that the way that they were presenting the issue to the public was false. That wasn't actually the way that they were perceiving the issue internally. I was wondering, so in the documentary, also that I mentioned, The Accidental Anarchist, you mentioned that through the process of the war and leading up to your resignation, you became disillusioned with the government and with public service, partly for this reason, and then also that there was a deeper disillusionment with the broader system of capitalist modernity. So I was wondering if you could walk us through both of these and sort of how one affected the other. And because you'd mentioned also that your politics already were quite left. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through if there were other particular experiences or influences that motivated your transition towards more radical politics, in addition to the issue around the WMDs, and then.
Sure. Well, to clarify, I was the Middle East expert at the UK mission to the UN before the Iraq War, not during the Iraq War. So in the run-up, I stopped doing that job about 6 months before the war actually began. But on the basis of that experience and a deep experience of the issues of weapons inspections and WMD, I eventually testified in secret to the first official inquiry into the war, not Parliament directly, but an official inquiry into the war called the Butler Inquiry, where I testified that the government had exaggerated the case for war, had exaggerated its argument that Iraq was a threat because of its WMD, that in fact, when I worked on it, and there was no reason to think the situation had not changed, we did not think that Iraq's WMD constituted a threat. In fact, we had no direct evidence of any WMD whatsoever. We just had various suppositions about what might be there, but no empirical evidence of what actually was there. And also that the government had ignored an alternative to war, which in fact I had written a paper on, which was a re-engineered sanctions regime on the Iraqi government, which would have prevented it militarizing and posing a threat to its neighbors or indeed to anyone else. And in my view, both of those things constituted a very grave breach of the government's responsibility to international law, but also to its people, namely that of telling the truth about war. It lied about war. And that presented me with a crisis. I was serving in Kosovo at the time for the United Nations on secondment from the British government. And I decided somewhat agonizingly to quit, to resign at that point, because I couldn't contemplate going back to the Foreign Office in London and working with officials and ministers who I knew to have been complicit in these lies. It was just something I just couldn't see myself doing. A very painful moment, because I'd imagined I would be a diplomat for the rest of my career. But as you say, there was in parallel a deeper disillusionment that was germinating within me. As I said, I was always a very political person, so I paid attention to the news a lot. It wasn't just disillusionment over Iraq that eventually caused a shift in my politics. It was the fact that our political system seemed to be failing large groups of people, particularly the poor. It was failing to address the emerging ecological crisis of global warming. These were just two indices of a system that was not working. And I wanted, in a very genuine and open way, to explore alternatives. And before I had quit, I had in fact taken a year off the Foreign Office on a kind of sabbatical, which the Foreign Office very generously gave me, to explore these kind of topics. And I told the Foreign Office I just wanted to do some research on the empirical basis of policy making. But in fact, it was a broader project of reading really everything I could lay my hands on, to examine what might be an alternative to the capitalist democratic, if you can call it that, the neoliberal system that we had in place and we still have in place today. So it was a search, really. It wasn't a conviction. It was the opening to a search that continues to this day, because I don't think anybody should have the complacency to say that they know the answer of how to govern a society. I passionately believe that that answer lies in the people, that they have the answer to how to govern themselves. I don't know what that answer is. I have some suggestions about how to generate and permit their answers, but I don't know what the ultimate shape of that dispensation would look like. I certainly don't have a plan that I wish to impose on others, and I think anybody that does is it's problematic, if not actually fascistic, to say that you have a plan for how people should be governed, because ipso facto you will be ignoring their views on the matter. Anyway, cut a long story short, all of that ended my career in the Foreign Office. I had thought I'd be a diplomat for the rest of my professional career, so it was a very great blow, and left me scrabbling for a professional alternative, which then became Independent Diplomat.
Before we transition to discuss this, I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a bit more on this search that you mentioned. So as if you could walk us through maybe if there were stages to it, or the particular, if there were discoveries of particular cases. I think of, for example, in the documentary and in your writings, you draw a lot of inspiration from the Spanish Civil War. And then also there's the relationship with the Kurdish movement, which we will come to later. So I'm wondering if in this time when you said you went on sabbatical and began searching, if there was a process of discovery or particular things you came to that really shifted you in the direction of what pathways towards an alternative?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wouldn't have said I was led directly to anarchism. I think the realization that what I was thinking was anarchism was to come later. In a very naive way, what I was looking for was what I called a sort of people-centered politics. What would politics look like if you put people at the center? And that's such a cliche. I mean, you know, there are all kinds of boring politicians' memoirs called Politics is People and whatnot, but that's what I was looking for. You know, what is it about the human? What about the human dictates how the human should organize his or her affairs with other people? And actually, one of the most important books that I read was a rather obscure philosophical text by Ludwig Wittgenstein called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which actually, and it's a long story, kind of blew up my worldview, because it said that there is a limit to logic, that you can only describe so much through logical representations, symbols, languages, terms, all the rest of it. And that in fact, what you can't describe, what doesn't lend itself to symbols, terms, or language, or numbers for that matter, is the most important stuff. And that's the stuff of the ineffable, the transcendental, religion, art, things like meaning, love. And of course, it dawned on me that my philosophical system relied on empirical science, relied on things like neoclassical economics, which has the arrogance to say that it does know what people want, that people actually want to maximize utility through consumption of goods and services. And actually what Wittgenstein was saying was that the most important things can't even be talked about. They can't be measured. You can't put words to them. And this was a very great revelation to me, because I realized that our society was on the wrong track, that we were pursuing in the material things, the measurable, the quantifiable, we were pursuing something that was identifiable, but it was arguably the wrong thing. It took no account of these ineffable qualities, these ineffable things, which are very hard to talk about, but are arguably the most important, and certainly according to Wittgenstein, were the most important. And that book really was a turning point for me, because it enabled me to step beyond logical systems. It enabled me to step beyond the very tight logic of market capitalism, where the graphs and curves and equations of neoclassical economics form a kind of castle, an interlocking fortification, which is very difficult to break down. Its logic seems to be completely comprehensive. And I think I was having trouble with that. And I think pointing me to the Ineffable made me realize that there was a kind of politics out there that enabled us to pursue the Ineffable, that enabled us to pursue what was most important, namely our connection to other people, love, meaning, solidarity, community. And what that was eventually to lead me to anarchism. But I didn't have a kind of revelatory moment where I sat and read Homage to Catalonia, where I thought, aha, yes, this is the answer. This kind of anarchism. I didn't really understand Homage to Catalonia, even though I'd read it many times. And I think it is a very misunderstood book, because actually what Orwell is talking about is anarchism. And he says at one point in the book that had he had his choice again, he would have joined the anarchists rather than the POUM, the Marxist militia that he did end up joining. And the way he describes anarchism makes clear why he would have been an anarchist, because he describes, in some ways, an ideal society, a society without hierarchy, where people called each other thou rather than you. The normal distinction between boss and workers was destroyed, and people breathe the air of equality. And he describes this as a very beautiful condition. But what he doesn't do is really describe the components of what that anarchist society are, how it came about, and indeed what happened to it. He describes the end of it in a sense, which took place on the streets of Barcelona when he was present, when the communists turned on the anarchists, which in a sense marked the great divergence of communism into state communism, away from a communism of self-government, which is anarchism. A terrible moment in the history of communism, if you like, and certainly the death of one of the most important experiments in anarchism in recent times.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very tragic moment, absolutely. But I find what you've said very beautiful. That if we call it revelatory moment of transcending or moving beyond the limitations of the confines of, we're going to call it the matrix of modernity, as it were, that has to be, that is extensive in everything being logically well defined, and moving beyond there for something that slips through those cracks.
Yeah.
So I would like to return to talk about this, but I want to pick up with what you mentioned already, that following your resignation, then you founded the Independent Diplomat, an advisory group that I mentioned already. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what the process of establishing that group, and how you came to that from this position where you were at then, or at what point the thinking for the group came in this process of seeking a politics outside of rationalist logic, if we call it that.
Yeah.
And the aims and visions of the group at the time, and the work that it's done leading up to your decision to move on from it later on.
Sure. Well, it's a long story. I mean, it's a 16-year story, up until the point that I resigned as executive director. Nothing dramatic in that departure, by the way. It was just me stepping on, time to move on to something else. I've left it in the hands of a very good person who I'm very close to. There's no drama in that. But how it began was in Kosovo, in fact. As I said, I resigned when I was serving as an advisor to the UN mission in Kosovo. That's where I submitted my secret evidence to the Butler inquiry. And it was Kosovo that provided the inspiration for what came next, because my wife said, why don't you advise the Kosovo government? So the idea is totally hers. She should get the credit for it. we had to fly back to London at that point, because essentially when I resigned the Foreign Office, I left the UN, I lost my job. So I went back to London. I flew back a couple of weeks later and had dinner with the Prime Minister, who I knew, and said, can I be your diplomatic advisor? And he said yes, and we clinked a glass of rakia together, and that was the beginning of Independent Diplomat. I became the diplomatic advisor to the Kosovo Prime Minister, and the reason that slot existed, that need existed, was because Kosovo was the subject of a very complex and secretive diplomatic process to determine its future, whether it should be a state or not. And it had no real seat at in that process. It was very much the subject of it. You know, it was determined, that process was governed by the UN Security Council, but of course Kosovo had no seat at the UN, let alone the UN Security Council. And the contact group was a group of, I think, 6 countries, which ran the process, the final status process, as it was called. And Kosovo was not one of those 6. It was, you know, presented with decisions by the 6 countries and by the UN envoy. And this seemed to me a profoundly unfair state of affairs, and caused a lot of political tension in Kosovo, which at one point broke out into violence, which we witnessed, a very disturbing thing to see. But it also seemed to me to be very stupid that, you know, Kosovo should be as well informed as it could be about that process, not least in order to assuage concerns that that process wasn't going to cheat them of statehood, which was very much the fear that somehow Russia and others and Serbia would prevent Kosovo from becoming a state, which was very much what the Albanian majority of Kosovo desired. Anyway, long story, I advised Kosovo for several years, helped them get to the UN Security Council to present their case to the UN Security Council, helped them through various talks, their relations with the UN, with the EU and others. And that became the genesis of Independent Diplomat, and the genesis of the philosophy, which was that there needed to be a service to countries and political movements that were somehow excluded from the diplomatic processes about them, and that they had a right to be part of those diplomatic processes. And Independent Diplomat was about exercising that right, about how do you actually take part in a diplomatic process that does not include you. And I dare say it wasn't really an anarchist project. It wasn't really about expression of the ineffable. In some ways, it quite diverged from the way my political philosophy was going, because diplomacy is a business of governments. And I work with government, I work with prime ministers and presidents and foreign ministers and diplomats of states. And it was very much a state-based process, because that was the business I knew, that I knew diplomacy, and that was the expertise and skill that I had to offer countries like Kosovo. And that was the model for Independent Diplomat. And in fact, it's one of the reasons I ultimately left Independent Diplomat, because I wanted to explore a broader concept of politics, which I kind of am doing today in a messy way, but basically to explore this project of how do you bring about a political dispensation that allows people to express what they truly want. What is that political dispensation? I would argue it's a form of anarchism, a form of communalism, as articulated by Murray Bookchin and others. But that wasn't the project of Independent Diplomat. You know, we ended up advising several countries. We advised Croatia on its EU accession. We advised a lot of self-determination movements, Somaliland, South Sudan, the Western Sahara, South Yemen, and others. We advised the Syrian Democratic Opposition, which is how I got to know the Syria conflict, and through that a bit what was going on in Rojava, but that's another story. So yeah, that's in brief the story of Independent Diplomat.
So I wanted to pick up from what you said at the end there, that it was through the consulting with the Syrian opposition that you first began to come to know the Kurdish movement a little bit. You've been a friend of the Kurdish movement now for a number of years, and you traveled to Rojava in 2017, which is also documented in the film, The Accidental Anarchist. So can you tell us a bit more about how you came to discover the Kurdish movement, what your impressions were, and how you came to go to Kurdistan and your journey there, and then your thoughts about the Democratic Confederalism Project and what the Kurdish movement is doing. And additionally, about democratic confederalism, and you also mentioned already the communalism or municipalism of Murray Bookchin, who's a big inspiration for the Kurdish movement, as you know, and many of our listeners do, I'm sure, as well. How do you view the significance of these ideas, and particularly those of Öcalan, have been developed organically to the conditions of Kurdistan, for the conditions of Western industrialized societies as well?
Yeah, I mean, only peripherally did I get to know about the Kurds because of our work with the Democratic Syrian opposition, and I dare say that opposition was quite hostile to the Kurds, mainly because the Kurds were not at war with the Assad regime. And I think I do understand their point of view that if you weren't at war with the Assad regime, then you were somehow facilitating the Assad regime. It's not a fair description of the politics of Rojava and why it's in the relationship it is with Damascus. That's a more complicated story, where the position of Rojava is, I think, completely legitimate. But anyway, that's how I got an entree into it. The reason that I got to learn about Kurdish politics and Rojava in particular was actually through the film, because we wanted to make a film about anarchism through my story. It was made by a production company, but for the BBC, by the way. We wanted to find a way of illustrating what was going on with anarchism. And as we developed the film and researched it, I began to hear more and more about Rojava, that there was this living experiment in something that could be described as anarchism in Rojava. And so eventually we took the decision to travel there and film it, because it seemed, that actual living experiments in anarchism are very rare, for good or ill, for ill mostly. So we shouldn't miss the chance to find out what was going on and see for ourselves. And that's what led to the trip, which took place in 2017. I didn't go for terribly long, I confess. It was very, very difficult to go for security reasons. We had to have a security presence with us, as well as a cameraman, a sound man, producer, all the rest of it, which costs a lot of money. And that was the reason the visit was circumscribed. But it allowed me to see some of the facets of democratic confederalism at work in Rojava, such as the communal assemblies, such as the YPJ. I visited a unit of the YPJ on the front line with ISIS. I also visited the justice system, well, they don't call it justice system, social peace system at work, in the case of a family one of whose members had been murdered. So I saw several different elements of the society at work, which was fascinating, and indeed is a reasonable representation of what democratic confederalism is saying. It's not a perfect situation, and I don't think any perfect society is feasible. All societies are the works of men and women are thus imperfect. But it was a fascinating and very moving example of what could be done in a particular circumstance. And that circumstance is, of course, war-torn Syria. And that circumstance is very different from what we confront in the West, in a country like Britain, where we have a very deeply entrenched system of democracy and capitalism. In Syria, what happened was the Kurds essentially took power in 2012. Whether the regime handed them power or just collapsed is moot, but they were able to
either way.
That was a power vacuum, and the Kurds were able to institute this system that had already been thought through by Abdullah Öcalan and others in the movement, and set up institutions fairly quickly that constituted a democratic confederal system, namely the communes above all, that they would be governed from the communal level. And today, I think that experiment, if you can call it an experiment, that revolution has been going on for 10 years. And I hope it will continue for many more years. And I think all of us who value anarchist ideas and are interested in anarchism need to look closely at Rojava, at its successes and failures, to learn what we can from it. Democratic confederalism, as you say, was developed by Öcalan for the Kurdish circumstance. But what he said in democratic confederalism is largely applicable elsewhere in terms of bottom-up self-government. It does tally pretty closely with the social ecology of Murray Bookchin. There's not much difference in terms of the philosophy of it. Bookchin envisaged a commonly led system which would confederate at higher levels or larger scale, a sort of commune of communes, and that's not very different from what Öcalan is proposing. Bookchin also proposes, and was the first really to come to the conclusion that you couldn't end the domination of man over nature without ending the domination of man over man, that these two forms of domination and hierarchy were intimately connected. And Öcalan again comes to a similar conclusion. And that helps describe why there is this ecological component to the revolution in Rojava, of an attempt to build an ecological economy. Formidably difficult in the circumstances of Rojava, still a country at war. Again, a work in progress. Anyway, so that's how I got to Rojava. We can talk more about Rojava if you wish.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, no, I appreciate very much what you said, and I agree both with your hopes and sentiments for the revolution and for the people. But about the philosophy, I think it's very true that, well, Öcalan and Bookchin as well is certainly global or internationalist, beyond internationalist, in their transnationalist in their hopes and aspirations. But something I find very beautiful is that both Bookchin and Öcalan are so historically oriented in their thinking, looking to deep history, and they find inspiration for this model, confederalism, municipalism, whatever you want to call it, in the deep history of the place that they're looking at. And for Bookchin, that place is predominantly the West, North America, the indigenous peoples of North America and traditions of Europe. And for Öcalan, the peoples of the Middle East. They find inspiration for this same kind of, the same family of ways of organizing, which to me points to the point that you were saying before about how can we find a politics beyond programmatic totalitarian planning, but that is about something very deeply human in us. So it really resonated when you said that. But I did want to ask you more about Rojava today, but basically just if you could say a bit about how you view the situation for Kurdistan in general today, particularly for Rojava with the Turkish state, both Kurdish people in Turkey, the invasions of Rojava, and also now of Iraqi Kurdistan fighting against the Kurdistan Workers' Party in the mountains in the north. Your thoughts about this situation today where we find ourselves, and the prospects for a peaceful resolution of the Kurdish question, which is the aim of the Kurdish movement?
Yes. Much depends on Turkey, I'm afraid, and its authoritarian leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is presently waging war on the Kurds in southeast Turkey and northern Iraq, South Kurdistan, and of course in Rojava, where 7,000 to 10,000 Turkish troops are in occupation of strips of territory just south of the Turkish-Syria border, and in Afrin to the northwest, where they are committing human rights abuses on a large scale, and where they are threatening to resettle large populations of Syrian refugees. And indeed, in recent days, there are signs that Erdogan may be accelerating his plans to do precisely that. He's been in talks with Putin on at least 2 occasions recently, and there are signs that Turkey is reaching some kind of reconciliation with the Assad regime itself, which hitherto they were very much opposed to each other, and there are signs that they are talking to each other now, which is potentially very worrying for Rojava, because they have a status quo with the Damascus regime where they are not fighting. They're not allies, but they're not fighting. And the last thing they need in Rojava is another front when they're already under assault from the north, from Turkey. A settlement to the Kurdish issue. Well, that's a very big question because it depends on the politics of 4 different countries. The most important being Turkey itself, where they have the keys to a settlement. There's no doubt that the Kurds politically are ready for a settlement, are ready for a ceasefire. Öcalan has often offered a ceasefire. There have been ceasefires in the past with the PKK. If the Turkish state were to pursue a ceasefire, I'm sure it would be reciprocated. And with a ceasefire comes the possibility of some kind of political settlement, which must involve recognition of Kurdish rights in full. Though notably, neither in Rojava nor in the words of Öcalan is any mention of statehood anymore. That Rojava sees Syria as a state, as a contiguous state that should not be broken up, but where they seek democratic autonomy in the northeast. I think it's very important to note this. It's very simplistic to look at the Kurds and say they want their own state. Part of the origin of democratic confederalism is Öcalan's realization that the Kurds would not in the near future have a state, and that how do you develop a society in the absence of a state? And of course, anarchism, by the same token, rejects the state. It sees the state as a form of oppression. And democratic confederalism and Bookchin's communalism were attempts to organize a society in a way that does not require a state, does not require centralized authority, does not require top-down hierarchy. It's a society without hierarchy. And I think that's very important to note. And it's often misunderstood externally. Rojava is called, Marxist-Leninist project or communist or just self-government, Kurdish governed or whatever. It's a multi-ethnic, autonomous, self-governing administration where women play a leading role in all institutions at a minimum, which is attempting to make its way in a world which is deeply hostile to that kind of dispensation. You're right that Bookchin and Öcalan took inspiration from earlier examples in their own context, but of course, today's Middle East is anything but self-governing, autonomous, multi-ethnic dispensation. The ziggurat model, as somebody put it to me in Rojava, predominates over highly centralized state structure within post-colonial boundaries, which by and large has been a disaster for the Middle East, and remains so. For the midterm, for the moment, I think the situation of Rojava and indeed the Kurds in Southeast Turkey is pretty perilous. It's pretty clear that Erdogan has embarked on a course of aggression against Rojava. Air attacks and artillery attacks have intensified, and there may be full-scale invasion. Although the word is that nothing public has been said, that he has been discouraged from this by Russia in particular, but also by the US. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And Turkey is quite capable of acting even if the Russians or the US don't approve of what they're doing. So the situation is dangerous for Rojava, as it is dangerous for the Kurds of Southeast Turkey, particularly in the run-up to next year's elections, where clearly Erdogan is playing the nationalist card to gain popularity.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a very, you are right. It is a very perilous time, and it is unpredictable. But the people there are, it's incredible what they are doing and the determination that they have for this very unique project that's so important, I believe, for the world. Because obviously, as you were saying, I'm not Kurdish, you are not Kurdish, but we and many other people are drawn to it as they were for Spain, or as they are for other examples like this. It's something for humanity. And so to transition from this, I wanted to ask you about the issue of self-determination more generally. the issue of reimagining self-determination, or the meaning of self-determination at the global level, both beyond and against the state, taking inspiration from Öcalan and others, is a central focus of our work at Peace in Kurdistan. And as you mentioned before, your work at the Independent Diplomat and elsewhere have long featured or worked together with peoples engaged in self-determination movements in various places around the world. And in your book as well, The Leaderless Revolution, you place agency, the issue basically just people being able to have the capacity to influence the conditions that they find themselves in, that govern their everyday lives, as a central tenet for apolitics. So I was wondering how, if you could tell us what self-determination means for you, and how you view it at that level of base local governance like that, or people determining their future. And then also how you view the issue of national or ethnic struggles for self-determination in the world today. Basically, you can say who the self is, who counts as the self in self-determining, who the polis is, who the people are. And what you see as the biggest impediments to and possibilities for genuine self-determination in the current world today.
Well, let's start by saying in your question, there are two very different kinds of self-determination, if you like. One is at the national level, the self-determination of having your own state. And the other is at the personal level, the self-determination of being able to pursue your own projects and flourishing as an autonomous human being. And those are two very different concepts.
Just to specify,
partly making it clear from my own thinking, Connor, not to criticize yours at all.
Right, you're absolutely right.
But they are pursued in very different ways.
And one, I just wanted to say as well, one has a very legal definition, self-determination with the state for a nation, and self-determination in all of its broad and theoretical exploration senses.
I mean, I have been involved in various self-determination struggles in Somaliland, Western Sahara, South Yemen, South Sudan, Kosovo. I've been in touch with all kinds of weird and wonderful movements around the world of people who want their own state. It is very difficult to get your own state. Above all, you have to have the agreement of the state which you are leaving. Palestine, of course, is the other big example. I've been involved in that struggle in different ways over the years. It is very difficult to get your own state. It requires an alignment of all kinds of international conditions for it to happen. It happened in Kosovo because there would have been a war if there had not been independence for Kosovo. It happened for South Sudan because of the same reasons, basically, because there would have been a renewal of the incredibly bloody Sudanese civil war if South Sudan wasn't granted independence. Both places were very large majorities ethnically homogeneous, though in South Sudan that was divided by tribe, but between a kind of, in very crude terms, an African and an Arab Sudan. And I'm afraid when you get to ethnic divisions, they usually are very crude and usually require drawing lines that shouldn't really be drawn. And indeed, my vision of self-determination is always of a multi-ethnic state, and Kosovo is supposed to be a multi-ethnic state. It is struggling in that regard. But anyway, that's another story. The international system is predisposed against self-determination. The existing family of states don't like new states because they don't like the idea of breaking up states because it might happen to them. So in general, other states are very unsympathetic to self-determination struggles, even when they are endorsed in international law, as is the right of self-determination for the people of Western Sahara, where the Security Council and the ICJ have both endorsed the right of the Sahrawi people to a referendum on self-determination, a referendum that Morocco, which occupies the Western Sahara, has prevented. So even when law and right is on your side, it is still very difficult to get your own state if the geopolitics don't align. In both South Sudan and Kosovo, crucially, the US supported independence. So I'm afraid you've got to have power on your side as well. In a US-dominated world, at least. Whether that changes, China is hardly favorable to self-determination, as its behavior and inside its own borders illustrates all too savagely. Turning to the individual concept of self-determination, that is core to anarchist philosophy and indeed to my own philosophy. What is it that allows the human to flourish? I think the only real reservation I would have about self-determination is the concentration on self, because I see the community as very much the source of human meaning, stability, creativity, all the things that really matter to me can't be achieved by an individual on their own. And I'm very hostile to individualism. So the idea of self-determination is more for me one of freedom to choose your human relations, a freedom from domination and from hierarchy, and that you yourself are not practicing domination or hierarchy, that you live in a condition of power equality with other people, and that is the best way to pursue human flourishing. That is the core of my political philosophy. And from that, what you get is a view of institutions that they should promote and permit relations of equality in decisions about the whole, in decisions about self-government. And that is the vision at the heart of Bookchin's libertarian municipalism, to give it another name, of communalism, and Öcalan's democratic confederalism. One can get lost in all this terminology, but basically it's people governing together in conditions of equal power, where they negotiate their affairs directly with each other, above all at the local level, and all power is located at the local level. And the confederal bit comes in when you have to make decisions at a larger than local scale. How do you do that? Well, the communes send delegates to a regional body, for instance, who represent the decisions of the communes in collective discussion with the representatives of other communes. It's fairly simple, but it is a complete inversion of the system of democracy that we have, the so-called democracy that we have in Britain today, where all the decisions are taken at the centre and implemented locally. Instead, all the decisions would be taken locally and implemented by the levels of larger scale. I wouldn't say higher levels or top levels, because that implies a kind of hierarchy, when in fact we're inverting the hierarchy of who takes the decisions and who administers those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I would add also, and I think for Öcalan and Bookchin and those in that family of traditions, that they're trying to engage also with this other sense of self-determination, where the self refers to the collective self, the community issue, right? Because the issue, like for Öcalan in particular, the way that he emphasizes democracy is basically to say, if you look just ostensibly at the word itself, if you want to say like the demoskratia, the rule of the people, that self-determination and the rule of the people are kind of the same thing in that sense, just who the self is. The self being, if you have a community or even an ethnicity, you can say is just built on historical cohabitation or whatever else. Over intergenerationally, over a long period of time, you come to make a community or a people or whoever. And now ecology, as we are, globalization, it's put in a global context, the human collective. So there's that issue of institutions as facilitating that. And there's a lot of, as you're saying, it can't be rationally planned. There's so many tensions and mixtures in reality to lived life. But I just wanted to add that there with the individual versus the more narrow legalistic national understanding. There's the communal, which I think is we're in agreement. It's what you were saying.
And one could go a bit further and postulate that there is no such thing as the self, that there is no self and other, that we only exist in relation to each other, and that the whom distinction should not exist, and the subject-object distinction is a fallacy, a mistake, at least in political terms, because it posits this separation and the idea of one entity doing something to somebody else, who is doing what to whom, as Stalin put it in his famous question, who has the power over somebody else? And if you abolish the notion of self and other and accept, as I think I accept, that we only truly exist in relationship to each other, then that problem falls away. You only become a community. You're not a community of individuals trying to arbitrate your separate selfish interests. You do look to other people to generate your collective interests. You know, you are part intrinsically of a broader community, which has its own separate set of values and interests, or not separate, sorry, you are intrinsic to those values and interests as well. And I think that's a very powerful notion. I mean, what we're trying to get past is Western individualism, and the notion that, you know, you can, I think the naive notion that you can determine your own life in isolation from other people, that you make your career plans, you make your life plans. You know, life does not work like that. Certainly when you get to my age, you realize that life doesn't work like that. Look at my life. I certainly never imagined I'd end up here. But this idea that you can forge a plan and follow that plan of your life is a very Western notion. And I think it's deeply naive, and it's deeply self-centered, and it leads to enormous frustration and unhappiness in individuals, but it also militates against a more human politics, where we are able fully to express ourselves, but only in communities.
Absolutely. And I think this segues very well to the issue of ecology too, because one way of looking at the issue is to say that the human, non-human distinction and privileging and hierarchy, as we were talking about before, is at the root of our current ecological crisis. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you briefly also about the issue of violence. So you have written, or you discuss in the Leaderless Revolution and elsewhere, in support of nonviolence in approaching the issue of systemic change or revolution, if we talk about it like that. I wanted to ask if you could tell us a bit about your thoughts on the issue as a whole, both, you say, ethically, morally, and strategically. I know it's a very large subject, so it's a bit unfair. And also then how you look at the issue of the capacity for and practice of self-defense, which is something that, for example, Öcalan emphasizes a lot in his writings, and that the Kurds obviously the Kurdish movement has taken up, and gets at this issue of, and the Kurds are a good example, you know, if you're in a position where you are deemed a threat by a powerful actor like the Turkish state, how do you respond? You know, if you build up capacity for self-governance to such a degree that they will just try to crush you with overwhelming force, and, you know, what do you do about that possibility? And today, in the era of modern weaponry and the absolute brutality of war, let alone nuclear weapons and other things like that, how do you view the issue of violence at that level, both geostrategically for movements and things like that, as well as the issue of systemic change?
Sure. A very big question, of course. I will avoid the question of the morality and ethics of violence, because that's just a quagmire. Ultimately, in my view, in very crude terms, morality just comes down to what you want. Yes, you can impose Kantian rules of universality on these, but it all becomes a kind of mind game. Of course, violence is a bad thing and should be avoided. My view of violence in the political context is one of pragmatics, of what actually works. At a fundamental level, I think that violence legitimizes the state, because the state loves violence. The state uses violence. It is the marker, according to Max Weber, of what states are, is their monopoly on the use of violence. And when you threaten a state with violence or use violence in any way, I think it helps the state legitimize itself. It gives it a kind of raison d'etre. It says, there is this violent threat, we must respond, usually with more violence. And it's somehow, I can't quite put my finger on it, there's a kind of circularity to that reasoning, which I think only strengthens the state. And this is why non-violence is so powerful against the state. And I think Gandhi, of course, and others, Martin Luther King, realized precisely this, that it was the contrast between the violence of the state and the non-violence of the resistance that was so powerful. That by provoking the state to use violence against them, but not themselves using violence, they were underscoring the illegitimacy of the state and the fact that the state only had violence to rely on in what it was attempting to do, how it was attempting to exert control. And I think that's a very powerful argument. On the other hand, I'm not the one who's, marching towards the staves of British policemen in colonial India and getting beaten to the ground and my skull crushed. It's easy to say. I certainly think that I'm not a pacifist. I do believe that self-defense is absolutely legitimate. And that's why, for instance, I believe that we should be helping Ukraine arm itself against the Russian invasion. I'm not anti-military in that sense. I think self-defense, it's legitimate in international law, and I think it's legitimate to help people in self-defense. It is, I think, one of the only, if not the only, legitimate form of violence. Using violence in other ways, I think, risks not only legitimizing the state, but delegitimizing yourself. That if you have to use violence to make your political point, you have lost something. You, in a way, are underscoring your own lack of power, your own lack of ability to mobilize a large group of the population. These are theoretical arguments. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, in their research, have, I think, fairly convincingly demonstrated that non-violent political movements are actually more effective than violent political movements in securing their political objectives. It's a slightly hazy research area. What you count as victory, what you count as failure is always a bit moot. But I think they've engaged in some pretty rigorous research, which shows that non-violence is more effective. And I think certainly in our world, the world of Al-Qaeda, ISIS and others who have used violence so ruthlessly, to use violence is, I think, in a way to identify with precisely the wrong kind of political actors. That if you can distinguish yourself by the forceful use of non-violence, I think that is a great political goal to aspire to. But it is easy to say. It is much less easy to practice. If I was a Kurd in Southeast Turkey, I don't know what I would do. It is easy for me to say resist non-violently. They may feel they have no option but violent resistance by membership of the PKK, for instance, and I respect that choice. I don't respect all the tactics of the PKK, and some of its past history is more than questionable. But that choice of whether to engage in self-defense through violence in a circumstance like that is one I'm glad I don't have to take.
Absolutely, as am I. I hear you, and I also hear resonate in that what we were discussing before concerning the issue of our humanity as the basis for approaching politics, and that there's something, well, because it is violence, because it is destruction. And when you get caught in those cycles of it, it's very anti-human in a lot of ways, very dehumanizing for the people doing it, for the people suffering it, for the entire, and so I really do hear you. I would like to, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you look at the example of the militias in Rojava, of the Syrian Defense Force, the SDF, and its component parts, the YPG and the YPJ. I think their use of violence is absolutely legitimate. I mean, they are facing a heavily armed conventional threat from Turkey, but also the irregular warfare of ISIS, which continues to be a threat to this day and was a very grave territorial threat. And, there's no question that violence was the appropriate response to that.
Absolutely. I agree. And that's where the flip side, I suppose, that violence is a part of the universe, and there's nothing more human, I guess, than a person defending their home also from
Yeah.
solar effect.
Yeah, and when I spoke to them, they were not only defending their home, they were also defending this new way of doing things, this new democratic feminist way of doing things. And they were very inspired by that. That power of consent and of will is a very important component of military power.
Absolutely. I do agree with, and as you said before, it's such a difficult issue too, one that we could spend very, very long speaking about. But I wanted to move on to ask you what we'd already discussed a little bit, the issue of ecology, which has become a focus for you recently. As I mentioned, you are currently the Associate Director for Geopolitics, Diplomacy and Security at E3G, which is an independent climate change think tank. Can you begin by telling us how you view the ecological crisis in general today a little bit, and how and why you came to focus on that issue, and then also the work you're doing and your thoughts on pathways for transitioning to an ecological society, or how the role that social and political efforts have in relation to the environment today?
Sure. Well, I think the ecological situation is very alarming. I don't think most of us have really grasped how bad it is, I'm afraid to say. And one of the depressing things about my work is being confronted by those facts every single day. We are pretty clearly on a pathway well above the so-called safe level of 2 degrees centigrade, which I don't actually regard as a safe level in any case, given what we're already seeing at 1.2 degrees centigrade, which is already clearly unsafe. But we're on a pathway to, well, much higher than that. And there are plenty of reasonable scientists who think we're on a pathway to 3 degrees centigrade or more, which is a disaster, an absolute global catastrophe. So the situation is bad. That's partly why I got involved with it. Not partly, that's mainly why I got involved with it, because I think it's a very urgent situation and it concerns me a lot. What to do about it? Well, my work is very much about influencing government policy, particularly at the international level on things like the COPs, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think you have to be an expert to observe that those processes are not working. They're not bringing carbon emissions down fast enough. Whether they will remains highly questionable. I think there's grounds for great skepticism that the mechanisms we've got in place will deliver the kind of decarbonisation we need to see, where we need to drop emissions very massively in the next 8 years. And beyond to net zero in 2050, and even that arguably is not enough. Instead, I think I have come to consider theories like that, what's called degrowth, where basically we need to pursue a different pathway economically. Rather than concentrating on growth, we need to concentrate on well-being, these other things that matter to us. So this is the, if you like, the synchronicity with anarchist philosophy, that I envisage a political and economic change going hand in hand. But an economy that is not premised on growth, where in fact, in material terms, it consumes less. And that this is the only way to get carbon emissions down fast enough is by consuming significantly less on a continual basis. Particularly this applies to rich countries. This doesn't apply to developing countries, which emit far, far less carbon than we do in any case. They should continue to grow as necessary, perhaps up to a certain plateau, where they will have decarbonized in any case. You pursue deep decarbonization in any case, and hopefully eventually you get some status quo where you have achieved net zero, but partly that has been by reducing your material footprint on the world through consumption.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned it there as well, the issue of the general well-being, and that being the synchronization with the human element, and then the non-human as well for the political basis. I'm wondering if you, it was something it was something we mentioned briefly when we were discussing that aspect before, if you view, or what your view is on that idea of there is no human self, and breaking down those boundaries and barriers and looking at interconnectedness, interrelatedness, interdependency, how that relates to the environment as an issue of our dependency on, on the rest of the world, on the environment, the ecosystem, the biosphere. And on that same topic, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the documentary, The Accidental Anarchist, that at one point in your search, in your journey, coming to learn about complexity theory and dynamic systems was impactful for you in shaping how you view global systems, institutions, and also then I wanted to ask you about the relationship with ecology, and how that fits in with your general, with your political views, but also your general broader worldview, I guess, and you the lessons you think such thinking can offer our political search for an alternative.
Sure. Well, my view of the human and nature is probably a fairly conventional one. Obviously, we are intimately connected with nature and dependent upon it, and we have exploited it horribly at the risk now of destroying it and destroying its abilities to sustain us. That's ultimately a pragmatic view of human survival, rather than a more spiritual view, if you like, of deeper connection between man and nature, which I'm also prepared to entertain, but I'm driven by the pragmatics of the situation, of the necessity of human survival in a collapsing planet. In terms of complexity theory, I almost randomly came across it as an idea. In fact, when I was feeding my baby daughter at 4 o'clock in the morning, an advert came on pay TV for a course in complexity theory as part of a thing called The Great Courses, which you could then buy on DVD, showing my age a bit. This was 20 odd years ago. No, well, it can't have been 20 odd years ago. It was my baby daughter, and she's only 15, so it must have been about 14, 15 years ago. Anyway, sorry, a digression. I did the course on complexity theory, and it struck me that several elements of complexity theory are relevant to the way the world works politically and economically, and various concepts in complexity theory can be helpful in understanding the world today. One is basically that the world is a complex system, that it is billions of actors in constant interaction. You can't ever know the state of that system. You can't fix it in time. As soon as you fix it in time, it's already changed. And complex systems have various characteristics which are not those of a chessboard. They are much more dynamic. They adapt to new circumstances. You can change the whole system by just switching one part of it in certain circumstances when the system is at a state of so-called criticality. Also, most people are familiar with the concept of tipping points, which in complexity theory is very important because it illustrates how a system can move completely from one phase to another. Its condition changes across the system, which to me is a very optimistic view because it offers the possibility of comprehensive change being driven by small actions. That we think we have to be big to make changes, but in fact we can be small. And you look at Greta Thunberg and what she has achieved by demonstrating one afternoon in front of her school alone, and now becoming a spokesperson on climate with more legitimacy than most world leaders. So it can be done. Circumstances have to be right. It's not saying that any small action will make a worldwide difference. Of course, that's silly. But it's showing that in the right circumstances, some small actions can have a seismic system-wide effect. And I think that's ultimately very encouraging. So I have found complexity theory a helpful lens through which to see the world. It's not the only lens to see the world. I think we need several. We need an economic theory, we need a political theory, We need an anthropological theory. We need perhaps even a spiritual theory as well, to help us understand our surroundings and what it will take to remedy the crises we're in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely, and it's a beautiful notion. I agree with you. There is an optimism in that, and that is beautiful. And this segues well to picking up a topic I wanted to pick up that we discussed before, the limits of narrow rationality. You're saying in the perfectly well-defined, predictable systems, or conception of systems. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, both about how the encounter with well, I mean, so we discussed Wittgenstein already a little bit, and this idea that the most important things are those that cannot be spoken, or that always exceed, you know, the ability for direct expression and communication. And you also alluded to the importance of the spiritual dimension and the metaphysical dimension. Can you tell us a bit about the significance of that notion, the excess, and that general realm of things for you personally, and and in your humanity, as we've been discussing, and then how a bit more about how that relates to your politics and the outlook on the world, ecologically and otherwise.
Sure. This is a difficult area to talk about, because everything starts to become very hazy, and you know, you rely on things you believe rather than things you can prove. And I mean, suffice it to say, that realm of the ineffable that Wittgenstein was talking about is important to all of us. In it resides things like meaning, purpose, love, hate as well. Inexpressible things that we only have words that vaguely connect to the enormity of what they are and the enormous importance they carry in our lives. And somehow we have to re-weight things in our world so that those things are given their due weight, rather than the more measurable things which are overvalued in our society, material things. And I would like to see a society where those ineffable things are primary, are, as Wittgenstein says, the most important things about us. They are the centerpiece of what society should be about. They are celebrated, they are pursued, their pursuit is optimized, to use a slightly kind of technical way of describing it. But you see what I mean. As for me, you know, my exploration of that realm continues. I was very much an atheist, a very much materialist, scientific atheist, that you could only believe in things that could be proven, you know, scientifically. Very much a Popperian view of what that might consist of. And that leads you to a fairly bleak worldview, that there isn't basically anything else except, you know, these material things around us and each other. And when we step off this mortal coil, that's it. There are those who believe that we need a more spiritual approach to political change if we're to be successful, if we're to transform neoliberalism, you know, this form of democracy that we have, this imperfect form of democracy that we have. If we are to transform this system, we need a spiritual renaissance, a rebirth, to power ourselves through that change. Or perhaps that there will be a collapse of that system before there will be a spiritual rebirth, which is a more pessimistic way of looking at it. I have some sympathy with the view that having a spiritual view of our existence on Earth does help this political project. I think believing that these ineffable things are more important, the transcendental is more important, is important. And I think it's an important driver of my politics and my view of how society should be organized, and things that can emerge from human organization which are beyond words. So in a sense, the organizational political part of it is very pragmatic, but what I hope to emerge from it is transcendental. So there is if you like, a spiritual component to it. Don't ask me whether that gets into belief in God or the afterlife or anything like that. I'm not there yet, but I do believe in the validity of religious experience, that people have experiences and beliefs which are to them of transcendental importance, and I respect that. I think the dry atheist view of the world is a very arid one and doesn't quite capture what we're actually about as humans. And I think, ancient history to today, and by that I mean history of millennia and eons, does demonstrate that humans are fundamentally spiritual in their nature, as well as pragmatic, as well as looking out for their material survival. And I think we have to attend to that.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. It resonates a lot what you said, and I would say for myself, I have similar views about the significance of the realm of the ineffable, and the transcendental, and that politics, as you said earlier, politics since its oldest beginning, it's before the word politics of the polis, that it was always about human thriving and going beyond. Politics was to secure the ability to do other things, to freedom and creativity and growth, which is exactly about all of these ineffable things. So I want to ask, we've covered now a lot of ground in many things and aspects of the situation today. I would say that we find ourselves in a very historical moment these days, these past number of years, and one that's unfolding in a lot of ways. I wonder if, in closing, you could share with us a bit how you view sort of this general point in history where we're at, beyond a little bit, what we've already said, touching on all these different aspects, and in particular, what your thoughts are on the method of approach for the work today, for organizational work, specifically in a context of a place like the UK, us at Peace in Kurdistan, trying to build connections between different movements, different peoples working in different areas towards a more holistic or interconnected view of what's going on, and the need to share with each other and work together across different issues in different places. What your thoughts are on method of work in general, and second, if you could share with us any particular plans or projects you have upcoming in your work personally.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question to conclude on. How I see things, I think I'm not the first to observe. I think we're in crisis. The economy is not working for the bulk of people. Capitalism is not working for the bulk of people. It rewards a tiny minority. Partly as a result, democracy is not working. People feel underrepresented. They feel they have no control over the decisions that matter to them. And underneath all of this is an ecological crisis of epic proportions. So we've got a lot of problems. And I don't see our current systems of government solving these problems. I think it's really naive to think that they can. But I also have some optimism that people are getting it, that people understand the crisis we're in. You can talking about these ideas 10 years ago would mark you as a real outsider. And I find that when I do start to talk about these ideas, people are much more receptive than they used to be. And I find that exciting and encouraging. Young people in particular are unconvinced by the stale logic of capitalism and representative democracy. They can see it's not working. It's not working for them as individuals. It's not working for society. And they're looking for alternatives. And I find that hopeful. In terms of how to go about things, I wouldn't want to make any generalizable rules. I think what you're talking about, connecting movements, is absolutely right. We should be seeking solidarity and change. Change movements should be looking to one another to learn lessons and support each other. There's no question that movements do better when they are in an ecology of other movements which are pointed in roughly the same direction. So I think the fights for social justice, against racism, against sexism are very much aligned, for instance, and should be feeding off one another and supporting one another. I also think movements need to avoid charismatic leadership and practice the participatory principles that I believe in, of reflecting the mass movement, giving people a say in the direction of the movement, things that XR is very much attempting to do. You know, these are new cultures of politics that we all need to learn, and learning it through the movement is a very powerful way of doing it. And I think it really builds people's commitment to and sense of belonging with the movement in a way that can really compensate for the lack of belonging and meaning that we feel in so much of the rest of our lives. As for my own projects, I'm trying to write another book about all of this, tentatively titled What Is to Be Done, that attempts to wrap all of this up together in a convincing whole theory.
Asking the questions 100 years on, it does seem to be asking.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's my personal. I'm not finding it easy, to be honest. It's not easy to wrap all of this up together, and you know, you kind of feel a bit of an idiot for taking it on at scale. You know, who the hell am I to take it on? But you know, I do believe in these ideas that we've been talking about. I do passionately believe in them, and I believe that when exposed to them, other people will accept them and believe in them too. Because what I want of a society of flourishing human beings living in freedom, but in equality and without hierarchy, is I think what many people want. And I think if you put the mechanism in front of them of how to get there, they will pick it up.
I share your hopes and beliefs, and admire your determination, and I'm very appreciative of you taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I don't know if there are any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, or.
No, I think I've said enough.
Thank you very much again, Carne.
Thank you. I really appreciate the conversation.
As did I. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.